We have successfully disconnected the presentation from the state and the business logic. And we are able to reuse our presentation now in other applications. However, if we want to reuse our app component in the same application, like duplicating it, we still have problems. Let me demonstrate. If we go down to the app component and just wrap it in a div container, and instead of just having one app component duplicated, so we have two app components, the following problem arises. Let's hop over to the browser. We now start with two buttons, and each button has a state of 1. If we click one button, both buttons change. If we click the other button, the same happens. So why is that so? The problem here is that both buttons fire the same button clicked event if they are clicked. And for every button clicked event, the increase action is triggered. On the increase action, we have our reducer that adds 1 to the state, and the state is just a number here. So our problem is that both buttons depend on the same state. So for each button, we need an individual counter. We can do that by adding a new reducer. But first, I will rename the reducer we already have to counter reducer because it is concerned with updating counters. And now we can introduce a new root reducer that also has a state and an action, and that again switches on the action type and has different cases for our actions. So increase gets a case, and our default case, as always, is just returning the state. And here we will represent our counters as an object. We will just have a counter 1 with a value of 0 and a counter 2 with another value of 0. And we will update the state by first cloning the state and then updating the respective counter that triggered the increase action. In order to determine which counter triggered the increase action, I will use an ID that I pass in a params value with my action. And the CID should have the same value as our keys in the object, so I can use it to call my counter reducer with the respective state values. So if I now use the CID, I select the counter value from the state that we want, and I can add the action to call the counter reducer. And let's add a semicolon here. Since our state structure changed, we have to update our selectors. The counter is now selected by passing a CID to a state. And we don't have a CID here, so I'll add it as a parameter for the function. Before we go on, let's make some minor refactorings here. I will just rename all app occurrences here to button, because that reflects better what happens here. Because now we can just rename our component down here to button 2, and now we have two buttons, which reflects better that we duplicated not the app, but a button. And now we can add a CID down here, and I will use the CID counter 2 for the second counter and the CID counter 1 for the first button. And we will have to add those CIDs to the select counter function 2. So counter 1 goes to the first button and counter 2 to the second. So now that we have the CID in place, we can pass it to our event and through the event to our action. And first I will access it in the parameters of the event. Then I'll add it to the event in a context field. I like to use a context field in events and a parameter field in actions to further distinguish between the two. Now that we pass the CID in our event, we can access it in our business logic. And first I will do a little bit refactoring here. and this didn't change anything. It's basically the same thing as we had before. And now I can access the context from our button clicked event and pass it to our action in a params field. Let's hop over to the browser and see if it worked. If I now click on the first counter, only the first counter changes, and we see down here in the inspector that the counter 1 field is updated. And if we click the second button, only the second button changes. With these changes in place, we have truly reusable presentation components.